Strive and Thrive is a collection of discussions featuring guests from various fields, focused on guiding entrepreneurs in creating businesses that excel in every aspect: people, planet, and profit. Throughout the series, you can join us, Romesh and Mike, as we explore relevant topics with our guests which can help businesses thrive.
Romesh and I met while I was supporting a client transforming their business, and I needed finance director support and reached out to him and his team. Since then, we've become good friends who share a passion for business and entrepreneurship. If you like today's discussion, then you want to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest episode with Chris Maslin of Go EO. We're going to talk today, love the show hands, Chris, brilliant. We're going to talk today about employee ownership trusts as an option for business exit. I've known Chris for a while. We were part of the same network group and we've built a friendship over the years. Chris has set up and sold his own accounting practice and has now founded another business, Go EO, which is focused on EOTs, or employee ownership trusts. I found Chris a great person to turn to for advice, and his clear, transparent, and ethical approach is reflected in the success he's driving at Go EO. So Chris, welcome to Strive and Thrive.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to date?
Yeah, sure. So just expand a little bit on what you touched on there. I was always into maths and physics. Those were my two strong subjects at school. I wasn't practical enough to go down the sort of engineering route, so I went down the economicsy route. Trained as an accountant in my very early 20s. I was always a bit of an awkward person, that employee always asking why and getting frustrated when I was told, because that's how we do it, that we've always done it that way. So basically, as soon as I could, I set up my own practice. Didn't necessarily have any amazing ideas, just didn't take orders very well and quite wanted to be in control of my own destiny. So after an extremely hard first year that I learned a huge amount and it was very humbling, it then blossomed. So over about 12 years, things grew steadily, bit by bit. And in 2021, I sold a controlling stake in that firm to an employee ownership trust. So that involved me taking a big step back from the business, empowering the senior team to really lead it going forwards. So I didn't step away completely. I still have some, 3-4 years on from that, I still have some ongoing responsibilities there, but they're greatly reduced. It's not, I'm not the full-time managing director there by any means. I'm more of a sort of occasional consultant, mentor. I've got a bit of wisdom because I've got a bit more experience than the senior team there, but they're the ones really running it. And since then, set up Go EO to help other businesses effectively do what I did with that transition 3 or 4 years ago. So I've got no complaints with the people that helped us do it, but it did just feel like there was a real opportunity for it to be streamlined and made a bit easier and more affordable to do.
Really interesting. Before we move into EOTs with you, Chris, because I've got loads of questions to understand it better, is what made you make that decision to step away from your accountancy business and set it up as an EOT? I imagine it wasn't the fact that you love EOTs, it was probably what your position at the time, right?
Correct. So I suppose the EOT was more the vehicle that seemed the most appropriate, rather than something that I'd fallen in love with and wanted to do that. So, one of the nice things was that the senior team there was super enthusiastic. They really wanted to take on more responsibility. The downside was that I'd lost the passion for it. So, I think it's a really dangerous situation when you've got the leader of the business who is less enthusiastic than the people beneath them. You want the person in charge to be really inspirational and to have great vision and want to push things forward, and you really want to follow them. And I felt like as time goes on, I wasn't that anymore, which was for a bunch of reasons. I think that, the business had done modestly well. So continued growth, yes, that maybe meant more money for me, more profit, but it also meant more stress. And I very much got to the point where I'm like, you know what, I'd accept a reduction in income for me if it came with a reduction in stress. So that's when I felt like, stepping back a bit seemed the right thing to do. I never really considered a trade sale or private equity or those kind of options. We probably would have been too small and uninteresting for private equity anyway. In terms of a trade sale, I'm sure there would have been bigger competitors who would have happily lapped us up. But I think I would have known that doing that, whilst I might have got a decent amount of cash, I think that half the staff would probably lose their job because of synergies. Clients would find the prices doubled because the buyer wanted to get their money back. So it would have felt a very awkward. I think it would have been a bit unpalatable for me. So management buyout wasn't really an option because the staff there, even the senior staff, are quite young. I didn't want to give it away. And I don't think they'd have been able to afford what I would have considered a half decent sum. So the EOT seemed the best of all those worlds. It enabled the staff to take control of the business. They don't put their hands in their pockets, so they're not actually paying anything to me for the business. But I still get paid a fairly decent payout for it.
Can you explain? You've gone nicely into where EOTs are. Can you explain sort of the background of EOTs, where it's come from, what the idea of it is? So it's really good that you've applied it to your own business, right? But more the theory bit behind it.
So in terms of the background, I mean, everyone's heard of John Lewis, right? They've been owned this way for about a century. But when they set it up, it was very much bespoke. No one else had done it before. So it was give or take 10, 11 years ago. Bless Nick Clegg, the guy who gets remembered as the one who promised he would not increase tuition fees and then did. That sadly seems to be his legacy, but I gather he was also integral in putting in place a more sort of standardized EOT model. So, if you do these things and you meet these criteria, you get these perks. So it's about 10, 11 years ago that it became a viable option that organizations started to look at. But I think it's fair to say there was not huge immediate uptake by any means. So it was kind of very much a fringe niche thing that a few people did. But over the last decade, it's become a lot more common. So in terms of the practicalities of how it works, so I alluded to the fact that none of the staff put money in. So you might be thinking, well, how on earth do I get paid? Well, I get paid out of the profits of the business. So legally what's happening, I'm selling my shares to this trust, a brand newly created trust. The trust has no money because it's literally just been set up, but the trust now owns the company. So the trust is entitled to receive the profits of the company. So typically you can often get an upfront payment if your company's been, frugal for a few years. You've got a bit of a war chest that's built up. So you've got a nice retained profit figure on your balance sheet. That's something that when you sell to the trust, it's inheriting that balance sheet as well. And it can immediately take some of that up to then use to pay you. And then equally, you'll typically be paid out over quite a few years from future profits of the business. So if there is one main downside to an EOT, the selling founder needs to understand they're going to be paid out almost certainly over a longer period than virtually any other sales mechanism. And there's also probably more risk that if something bad happens to the business, potentially 2, 3, 4 years post sale, they may lose out financially. They won't get all of what they'd hoped to get.
You touched on the advantages with your own business actually and giving it to the employees. Is that the biggest advantage of it? Are there other benefits of doing this approach over a sale or an equity sale?
So I think the kind of softer benefits will be about retaining the legacy. So like I say, the brand has not been sucked into, absorbed into some much bigger corporate. It's not disappeared. Whilst there is no guarantee that all staff will keep their jobs forever, there can't really be in any business. I think the likelihood of them keeping their jobs for the foreseeable future is highest. In terms of more black and white benefits, the one that people jump on, but I think should not be a main motivator for doing it, the sale is completely capital gains tax free. So I paid no capital gains tax whatsoever on the proceeds from selling the business. There are a bunch of criteria to meet to ensure that happens, but assuming you meet those, no tax to pay. So for most people otherwise selling a small business, you typically be looking at 10% with business asset disposal relief. Some of you may be aware that's about to go up to 14% in a few weeks' time, and most likely 18% a bit after that. So as things stand, I think the EOT is going to continue to be tax-free for the foreseeable future. So as the base rate of capital gains tax goes up, that appeal is perhaps going to get more significant and make it more appealing over the next few years.
And you mentioned earlier that it was niche and it's starting to grow. Why is it growing? What are the current reasons? Is it because of the tax opportunity, or is it because people are more understanding of the benefits of it now as they're seeing good use cases?
I think it's mainly about awareness. So my understanding, there's give or take 3,000 employee-owned companies in the UK now. So, that doesn't sound a big number when you consider I think the number of businesses in total is in the very low millions, but an awful lot of those will be one-person businesses. So to be employee-owned, stating the obvious, you have to have some employees. The minimum number of employees can be quite small. But yeah, there's about 3,000 of them. So I think it's a combination of awareness. Some of the big names that have done it in the last few years, Richer Sounds, that sell hi-fis and TVs, Go Ape, the sort of aerial assault course, Aardman Animation, the people behind Wallace and Gromit. So there's a few quite big names that have done it. And I think that helps people take comfort that it's not some convoluted, weird, aggressive tax avoidance scheme that they're going to get clobbered for. I think especially anything that includes the word trust, people get a bit nervous that it sounds a bit dodgy. Maybe we shouldn't do it.
Interesting.
Chris, I've learned a bit about EOTs from spending time with you, and I think it's a great idea. There's tremendous benefits, and there's a kind of social value aspect as well. But one of the things that I think is key, and again from having conversations with you, is that the scenario needs to be finely balanced so that it's a win-win genuinely for all parties. Can you take us through that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So I suppose an obvious question is, well, how much are you selling your business for? Normally, you have some third-party buyer that obviously must think that your business is worth something to them, otherwise they wouldn't be trying to buy it, but they're going to want to buy it for as low a price as possible. You're going to want to sell it for as high a price as possible. So you then got that negotiation and, a bit of haggling. So you don't really have that with employee ownership trusts. I've heard a few founders say that the only sort of thing that they were haggling with was their own conscience. So from a practical perspective, the maximum you can sell for is an independent valuation. But Romesh, I'm sure you've done a few of these in your time. There's a lot of subjectivity to valuations. So you could potentially get 10 different people to value your business and get 10 different figures of what it's worth. So an independent valuation, it doesn't give you the one correct answer, but at least it's someone professional who hopefully has a bit of experience that's saying, I'm happy enough that this is a reasonable figure for it. So that will form the upper limit of what you can sell for. And then it's really up to you, and to some small extent up to the staff. I'll perhaps go on a bit more about that later. But for you as founder, if you try and get the best possible deal for yourself, the real risk is that you might get the deal signed off, but if the staff start to feel like, there's really not a lot in it for us, we're going to have to slog our guts out for the next 10 years. Yes, we get a salary, but all of the profits are going to be going to the exiting founder. Do we love this business that much? Actually, there's a firm across the road that does broadly the same thing that's offered me $5,000 more a year. I'm just going to quit and go and take that job. And if you find a few of the senior team do that, you can quickly find that your business starts to struggle and maybe even falls apart. So in short, there is a real risk that if the founder tries to get a bit too greedy, tries to skew the deal too much in their favor, they might get it signed off because they're unlikely to have that aggressive negotiation prior to the sale, but it can still fall apart afterwards. So I think founders need to be aware of that, and they need to be thinking that there is a direct correlation that the better the deal is for them financially, the worse it is for the staff. And if it's not good enough for the staff, you need those staff to make it work for you to get paid. So you run a very real risk that it doesn't work for anyone and then you don't get paid.
Interesting.
How do you manage that?
Sorry, go on.
Yes. Yeah. How do you manage that? That must be, you coming in and advising on that, Chris. How do you manage that? Because I'm sure there's lots of scenarios that you're dealing with where the business owner, the seller, does want, obviously a decent return, and they're kind of almost negotiating against themselves, right? What are the challenges you find there? Sorry to cut across you there, Mike.
I think if the founder's primary goal is getting as much as possible for their business, then I don't think they should consider employee ownership, because I think the only way they can get the best possible deal by that route is by making the staff pay more for the business than anybody else would. And that's not in the spirit of EO. I think you run a risk that it's going to fall apart. So I do, you don't have to be altruistic. You certainly don't have to gift your business, but I think you do need to accept that, the capital gains tax will maybe enable you to accept a slightly lower gross sale price because you've got that tax break, rather than trying to win across the board and think, well, I'll get the maximum possible sale price and it will be tax free. So this is just, everything's going perfectly for me as the exiting founder. But I do have quite a few awkward conversations, most commonly over valuation, because someone will have spoken to either their mate Dave down the pub, we all know Dave down the pub, or a business broker who wanted their business and said, oh yeah, we can get 10 times profit for your business. Obviously, it's one thing someone telling you your business is worth that. It's quite another thing finding a buyer that's actually prepared to, transfer that much money to you for it. But a bit cynically, sometimes a business broker won't care. They just want to get you on their books. They get some money for that. If they don't sell your business, or they sell it but for way less than they suggested you might get, that's kind of your problem. But the downside of that for me is a lot of founders have in their head that their business is worth up here. And I'm telling them, with an EOT, I think you could get a value down here. And sometimes they're a bit offended or upset, or just, their plans for retirement take a hit. And a lot of the times they do just say, well, okay, thanks, but that doesn't work for me. I'm going to go elsewhere, which is fine.
Interesting. Is there a typical type of business that it suits better? Your examples are great, sort of with Richer Sounds, Go Ape, really kind of quite brand orientated, but unique businesses. Are there ones that it suits better than others?
I mean, so those three that I've mentioned are big ones that, just for the avoidance of doubt, GoEO had no involvement in those whatsoever. The most common ones we see, I would tend to say, would be some kind of professional services firm. So an agency of some sort. You do see a lot of accountants do this, lawyers, architects, marketing agencies, consultancies, increasingly like building companies. So I think there's by no means it has to be those kind of businesses, but I think a reason why it appeals to those businesses, the staff are quite critical. You often don't have that much in terms of real assets of value. There's not huge amounts of machinery or equipment. You probably don't have amazing intellectual property. And the reason why those things are important is that, if I think about your stereotypical Silicon Valley startup, right? So you've got some amazing idea, you've got a load of growth, you've got a lot of people who love it. Typically, those businesses are burning through cash. They are losing money at a rapid rate, but they've got external investors happy to throw money at it because they're growing at 200+% year on year. So there's that belief that even though in the short term we know they're going to lose money, that's they're planning to lose money, but it's because they're growing at a crazy rate. And the dream is that 5 years down the line, they'll be able to suddenly become hugely profitable. That's not going to work with an EOT at all, because you're only going to get paid out of profits of the business. So if you say, well, my business is worth loads of money because this amazing intellectual property, okay, great. But if it's losing money, how are you going to get paid that? So those kinds of companies, it realistically doesn't work. What it does work very well for is the nice, what I'd call steady Eddie businesses. Sorry if that's a little bit insulting to anyone who I'm about to describe, but their businesses may well be growing, but maybe 10 to 20% year on year. They've got good, reliable profits. Okay, sometimes they have a good year, sometimes a bad year, but it's quite stable. And that can kind of give you comfort that as a founder, as long as they don't do anything crazy soon after sale, you can reasonably expect those profits to continue, and that's what you're going to get paid from.
And I guess the risk within that, I suppose, is the founder's role within it. Because if it's a founder really driven business, then that is a risk, is it? Or is it that the founder can stick around under an EOT and support the business?
So the founder can certainly stick around. I mean, it's a very good point. And I suppose what I would say is that if you're currently, whoever's listening to this, leading a business and you know that you want to drive that business to grow over the next 5 years, you probably don't want to sell to an EOT now, unless you are sort of quasi-communist in your beliefs and you feel like, even though I still want to lead this business and I still really believe in it, I'm actually quite happy that I won't benefit from the growth of that business over the next 5 years. It's the key thing to bear in mind, that you will be selling your shares. So you're kind of cashing in your chips today based on today's value. And if the business rockets to success going forwards, you're not going to benefit very much from that. So you need to be at peace with that, which is typically either because, either you're retiring or you've kind of had enough of it, or you want to step away and you understand you're passing it on. Or like I say, maybe if you're just really of the view that I really want to drive this, and I'm very happy with the fact that all the staff will do modestly well out of this, and I actually won't do amazingly well out of continued growth. It won't particularly benefit me.
Good.
Brilliant. So Chris, can you give us a high level summary of when an EOT is a viable option for someone looking to exit a business, and what stage should they start to explore EOTs in more detail?
So I think that the business needs to be stable. Your typical startup where it's crazy, good, bad, etc., isn't super viable, because you just run a real risk of it collapsing. You need it to be nice and stable. The founder needs to be at peace with the fact that it won't be their company anymore, so they can carry on working there. And whilst they don't always, normally the founder will stay around for at least a few years afterwards. And partly that's sort of selfishly motivated, because they just want to make sure that the business doesn't fall off a cliff soon after sale. They want to help ensure that they do get paid. But yeah, they need to be at peace with the fact that it will no longer be their company. I think that's quite a big thing. You can still have some significant power, but you cannot control the company after the EOT sale. So there will be situations where you think the right path for the business to go down is X, but you get outvoted, and there's nothing you can do about that. So you need to accept that. What other criteria are there? Well, we tend to suggest the business probably needs at least 5 staff, and 5's really a minimum level. So at that level, the founder most likely is very heavily involved on a day-to-day basis, so probably will need to stay very hands-on for a while. If the business is more like 20 plus staff, then maybe the founder's already taken a big step back. There's already a small group of directors running it largely. So yeah, I think a minimum of 5 staff. There's no upper limit. Obviously, Richard sounds massive. Got no idea how many staff they've got, but I'm sure it's well into the hundreds, if not into the thousands. For GoEO ourselves, we're sort of focusing on that smaller end, trying to make it easier and more affordable for smaller businesses. So we probably have an upper limit of about 50 staff, just from the point of view of above that. Look, realistically, you want to probably go and find more expensive but more bespoke advisors who can really give your slightly bigger business, the care that it deserves.
Thanks, Chris. So having spoken to you about EOTs, or learning about them in more detail with you in our network group, I then spoke to someone, socially, a friend of mine who's an audit partner, actually, a fairly large firm. And just in conversation out of the blue, he kind of said, "Oh, you know what, Romesh, I was speaking to one of our clients who's recently sold his business via an EOT, and he's hating it." At which point I was like, "Oh, wow, I'd only heard good things." You've kind of alluded to some of the challenges when things don't quite get set up properly and the balance isn't there. This situation, I think the business owner who was selling just felt trapped in the business. They felt they were working really, really hard, and there wasn't much upside. Now, I think you've kind of probably alluded to some of the scenarios which might have contributed to that, but yeah, can you give us more thoughts on the risks of an EOT and what can go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things that can go wrong. Some of them sort of catastrophically wrong. Some of them just, this isn't quite as good as the picture we were painted beforehand. I mean, with that one you mentioned, it maybe sounds a bit more like it's a sort of management or leadership side of things, that the senior team, for whatever reason, were not doing a good enough job of leading that business. So the exiting founder still felt like they had no choice but to carry on leading it potentially with at least as much, if not more, stress as they had before. So, yeah, I mean, I guess what can go wrong? I think sometimes founders will be underwhelmed at the sort of entrepreneurship of their senior team. And I would debate who's at fault there. I think often when you're leading a business, you want to recruit someone that does as you say and does it really well, a really good right-hand man or woman. And that can be great. But then you've got someone who's perhaps quite obedient, good at following orders. And then suddenly you're saying to them, right, you're the boss now. You've got to suddenly have vision. You've got to make your own decisions. To someone who's never done that, you've always done that and just, told them what to do. So I think sometimes founders can be their own worst enemy there, in that you recruit people who are not suitable to lead, but they're really suitable to be a great, second in command. And then you tell them they have to lead, and then they underwhelm you because they've not quite got the mentality for that. So there can be an element of that. I think you do need to understand that just because you tell someone they're now a co-owner in the business, so they should act more entrepreneurially, won't mean they will overnight. I think that the valuation is a key one to my mind, because I think I do think there are a lot of founders that, for whatever reason, sell for too high a sale price, and then it ends up being a bit of a noose around the business's neck, especially if they're then also like adding interest onto it. So, I'm sure we all know people with student loans where every month they make a payment of 50 quid and then the interest adds 100 quid to the debt. It can feel like that with with EOT deferred consideration. And that all comes down to that initial setup of the deal. How friendly was it to the founder versus to the staff? Other things that can go wrong. I mean, I think there is a risk that if you go 100% EOT, no one's got a lot to lose if things go wrong. So there's a bit of debate in the employee-owned world, and there's arguments either side as to whether 100% employee ownership trust is the best method. It's the simplest. It's perhaps the most fair. You don't have to worry about different staff having different motivations. All the staff should be pulling together. They've all got the same goals. But a downside of that is, you might have sort of heard the phrase skin in the game. Typically what we mean by that is that someone's got a lot to lose if things go wrong. So when things start to go a bit wrong, you do whatever it takes. You potentially have sleepless nights, work weekends. You do not quit. You do whatever it takes to turn that business around. And if you're 100% EOT owned, no one's really got that. The most they've got to lose if it goes horribly wrong is their job. So again, if you're having a rubbish week, clients are being grumpy, staff are moaning, systems are breaking, there's not much financially to tie you to think, you know what, I'm going to stick around and make this work. So, perhaps if you really love the business and you love the team around you, then you're going to go through that, you're going to fight through that anyway. But I think that can be a risk with the 100% EOT model.
Can I ask a question linked to, you've touched on an interesting point. We've talked a lot about the commercial structure of an EOT, which is, I know, where you focus. But do you have to help on the governance side and the organizational decision-making side within this? Because if you're taking a small business of 20 people with a strong founder, like you said, there's a team that are used to that kind of structure, to suddenly have to flip into an upside-down model almost. Do you find you need to support the governance model? And is that a challenge for businesses as they move into EOT?
I think it can take a bit of getting used to. I suppose one thing I would stress is that just because a company becomes employee owned doesn't suddenly mean it's a communist thing where everyone is equal. So the business will still have directors who can potentially fire the staff who are underperforming, will still lead the business, still make the decisions. It doesn't suddenly become, you need a referendum on every decision and all staff get to have their say. So the directors will still control the business, not really any different to a privately owned company. The key thing that will have changed is effectively the shareholders of the business, which previously was the founder, and more often than not, the founder will have been the main director leading the business. So in that situation, pre-EOT sale, that founder is invincible because the shareholders can potentially kick out the directors, but you're not going to kick yourself out. So using the founder as an example, if they sell to an EOT, they can still be a director, they can still be the full-time managing director calling all the shots. But they need to accept the fact that sitting above them will be a board of trustees who potentially, this is very much a nuclear big red button last resort thing, but potentially those trustees can say to that founder, we think you're doing a rubbish job, we're kicking you out. So, that won't have been something that the founder will have had before. So they need to be at peace with that they can be kicked out of what they probably consider their company, because they're just going to become an employee, albeit one who's owed a bit of money from it.
Interesting. So in effect, keeps the existing governance model and the existing structure is still fine. It's just the fact that you've got a different orientation around the ownership of the company.
Yeah, so you've got this extra concept of trustees who effectively replace the shareholders. And again, I think in most small businesses, Romesh with an accounting background will be extremely aware of the difference between shareholders and directors, but your average small business owner doesn't really understand the difference because they're both. So it doesn't matter if they're making a decision, am I making this as a shareholder or as a director? Equally, when they get a salary, that's not because they're a shareholder, that's because they're a director doing work. If they're getting dividends, that's not because they're a director, that's because they're a shareholder who owns the company. But to them, those things are all kind of often merged together. So the trustees will be a new role that effectively replaces the shareholders. And the other thing that's perhaps key is that it will be the employees who can exert pressure and potentially choose some of those trustees. So you've gone from this linear power structure, shareholder at the top, then directors, then staff, to a circular one, where you've still got directors in control of the staff, but then the staff can effectively have some power over the trustees, and the trustees have power over the directors. So no one's invincible. You've got this sort of circular system going.
Chris, you talked about a 100% EOT scenario, which is the standard setup. Tell us some more about a more kind of nuanced, more sophisticated blend. How does that work? What do you typically see? And does it work? Is it better?
Well, that final question depends who you ask. There's pros and cons. So 100% EOT owned is the simplest. It's quite straightforward. There's lots of things you can do if you want to complicate matters. I say obviously complicating matter isn't the choice. That's the byproduct of making something that makes sense. So sometimes a founder will only sell part of the business to an EOT. They do need to sell a controlling stake to get the tax perks. So they need to sell at least 51%. But you could potentially sell, let's say, 75% of the shares to the EOT, and you keep 25% in your own private ownership. So a reason why you might want to do that, if you do think that business is going to continue rocketing to success, 25% of that business you'll still own. So if 10 years down the line, when it's 10 times the size, it gets sold to an external third party, you'll still be able to cash in a bit on that personally. The other thing that you might quite often want to do, and it comes back to that skin in the game thing I talked about earlier, is try and find a mechanism for getting some shares into the hands of the most senior people there. So again, it's a double-edged sword for them, and anyone who started their own business will know what I mean by this. You've got a lot more to gain if the business does really well, if you own some shares in it. You're going to get all that upside of the increase in value, increase in dividends as profit goes up, etc., etc. But you also know that you've got something to lose because you had something of value, and if you walk away or it collapses, you lose that value. So this is where there'll be things like EMI share options, which again, some people on this call might be familiar with. So often these can sit quite nicely alongside an EOT. So typically what the founder might do, you sell, let's say 100% to the EOT. So in the very short term, the EOT owns 100%. You as founder have sold all of your shares. You get all the tax perks of that. Also, the company is now probably worth a bit less because perhaps it did have a big war chest of retained profits, but you've cleared that out as part of the sale. And then effectively the day after the EOT sale, you then issue some share options to some of the senior staff. So what that means in practice is that you say to those senior staff, we are giving you the right today, the legal right that's going to be set in stone, that in perhaps 5 years' time, you can buy this many shares for this price. And we agree that price today. So what you're then hoping is that over the next 5 years, those senior team think, right, I've locked in that ability to buy at this price. So if I really build the business from here so that in 5 years' time, it's worth twice as much, 10 times as much, that's going to be really worth something because then I can still buy at that low price committed to today. So again, it's just giving them that extra incentive to want to push the business. And also, if you set it up in a way that they know that that's got real value to them and they don't want to lose that, it's another thing, sort of not preventing, but discouraging them from leaving and going elsewhere, because they know if they leave, they're going to lose the right to that share option.
Okay, that's really interesting, and that's a nice kind of solver for certain scenarios, I think. So at Strive and Thrive, one of the things we're quite animated about, Mike and I, is the triple bottom line. People, planet, profit. And I think for me, that's really what appeals with the concept of an EOT. It resonates very much with current thinking on equitable outcomes. So I think it's very much part of the Zeitgeist at the moment. And Mike, what are your thoughts?
So yeah, after we met first time, Chris, and I've been doing my little bit of research, and I think what I find really interesting in this space at the moment is how some of these different governance commercial models, let's call it a commercial model or structural model for a business, is actually more empowering. And the nature of businesses nowadays is moving towards distributing the wealth from the richer to the poorer, letting the numbers of lifestyle businesses that people are running, micro businesses, is really interesting. And I think actually the nature of the internet and smaller businesses, more dynamic businesses that actually, as you say, are people orientated as well, not just IP and product related. Do you see a kind of overall shift as you play in this marketplace around ownership models and the need to think about things in a different way? And is there more of an appetite to think about different types of ownership models?
In short, I'd say yes. I think where Romesh, you mentioned the people, planet, profit. So people, yes. Employee ownership trust, that's at the heart of it, that it's all about giving everybody that little bit more. The downside of that is ignoring the founder. No individual employee is going to get hugely rich off an EOT, because it's all about us all being in this together. We're going to share all the tough times and we'll share the good times. So because they're spread very widely, none of those employees is going to get £1 million in profit share. It's just not going to happen. But, in terms of income inequality, wealth inequality, I'm not saying EOTs will magically solve that problem, but I think it will help. Perhaps over the last 20 plus years, the world has become a bit more capitalist. The wealth divide, you've got your Jeff Bezoses and your Elon Musks of this world becoming extremely wealthy whilst paying some of their staff pretty much minimum wage. So it helps with that. Planet-wise, I believe there is some correlation, but perhaps more indirect rather than direct. So, the kind of businesses that become employee-owned tend to care a bit more about their local community, tend to care a little bit more about the environment. Again, there's not a direct correlation there, but I think it's just, you wouldn't be considering employee ownership if you were purely focused on what will make the most money for me. So again, it tends to, the kind of people that care about that also care about these other things. But I think it's important to note that the profit motivation should very much still be there. Employee-owned trust companies are not charities. They're not trying to be. They are profit-motivated businesses that want to make money. It's just about how those profits are spread when they are made. So I think that's important that people understand. Sorry, that was more Romesh's point than yours, Mike.
No, it really builds on it, and I think, do you think that it is about enabling the people in their organizations and the sharing and the responsibilities of their organizations? And do you think it adds as a motivating factor for loyalty? Did these companies you work with see improved loyalty, improved contribution towards their businesses because they're feeling part of it?
I believe there is some evidence, yes, but I think it's the kind of thing that, again, I touched on this earlier. Sometimes founders will think, right, I'm selling to an EOT today. That means within the next week, the staff will have come up with amazing ideas and they'll be working twice as many hours because now they're super driven to push the business forward. That doesn't happen. So I think, the changes will be very modest there and they will take time to come in. I think also, whilst the staff might be told what an EOT will mean, it will take them a while, before they get their first profit share payment. And it might take them a little while longer to start to think, oh, you know what? If we cut back on this cost or we manage to make a bit more money, then that'll actually benefit us because we'll get the profits. To any business owners, that's just totally obvious. But for your typical employee, They're all about, right, how do I make my salary as big as possible and how do I get more holiday? And I think it can be one of the biggest frustrations, again, of a founder that, you say to the staff, right, what do you think would be the best idea to really push this business forward? And the staff will have a lot to think about it. And then they'll say, we should all get a pay rise and have an extra week's holiday. And it's like, that won't help the business at all. So it takes a while for that mindset to change. But like I said, the Employee Ownership Association, which is sort of like a not-for-profit union type that governs this, they do a lot of research, and I think they do find statistical evidence that genuinely proves that productivity is higher in employee-owned companies than non-employee-owned companies.
And I'm aware this is a UK initiative, and as you mentioned at the start of the call, but is it leading, and do other countries do different models that are comparable? What's your view on the kind of position of it in different countries, and does it work if you run a multinational company and things like that?
I'll tell you what, I'll park that final question for a moment. But in terms of other countries, lots of countries will have some form of employee ownership there. I mean, the Americans have what's known as an ESOP, which is very different to the trust, because an ESOP is more like the UK has a share incentive plan. So generally speaking, what happens with that is all of the employees are given the choice, if they want to sacrifice a little bit of their pay every month to buy a teeny proportion of the company. So, it really is small increments. But the theory is that if you're there for 20 years, when you come to leave, you actually own some shares in your own name. You can then sell those and get a nice nest egg from it. So that's quite different to the EOT model, where, right at the beginning of the call, I made the point that the staff don't put any money in, which is great in a way, because they're not risking anything, not risking their own money. But they need to understand that it's the trust that will own the shares, not them individually. So critically, that means when they come to leave, they don't get to sell anything. They don't get to take anything with them. They've gone. They don't get any profit share anymore, but they're not selling anything. So a lot of countries do have employee ownership type models. I think Canada has fairly recently followed the UK's route with basically a carbon copy of the trust model. I think the UK is the first with the EOT, in its current form. But yeah, we're certainly 10 years ago was not the first time anyone in any country attempted employee ownership. And yeah, your follow-up question about multinationals. So again, I would stress my expertise is very much in the smaller businesses, unlikely to have companies in other countries. My understanding is that if hypothetically, you might have a development team in the Philippines or something like that, if they're employed by your company, then they will be entitled to a share of profits. But one of the tax perks, which I didn't cover earlier, but I'll mention now, for the employees, the first 3,600 per tax year worth of profit share they get is tax-free. So no income tax on that. They will, however, suffer national insurance. Don't ask me why, that's just the rules. But if hypothetically these employees are in, say, India or Germany or wherever it may be, the tax laws locally will be very different. So they probably won't get any kind of equivalent of that 3,600 tax-free, but they should still be entitled to a share of profits. It will just be their local tax rules that will be different.
Interesting, really interesting.
Thanks, Chris. So it's really struck me in this conversation how clearly you've explained. I mean, that last bit was a bit more nuanced, because we're talking about kind of international tax there, I guess. But ultimately, I think you're really good at explaining, at very accessible, basic level, what an EOT is. And we've talked about the key to setting up an EOT successfully is getting that fine balance right and navigating potential conflicts of interest. We also touched on the fact that you have to kind of manage that when you're discussing the setup with your clients. One thing that struck me, and you alluded to this, was that I think it's also explaining to employees what this really means for them and how quickly it takes for the penny to drop. Because as a finance director, I've been amazed at times how sometimes what's obvious to me in senior management as a real staff benefit doesn't get taken up, or there's just not very much enthusiasm for it. And there's definitely a correlation between lower enthusiasm and more complexity. So I imagine one of the challenges for you, and this is a very long-winded question, but I imagine one of the challenges for you, as well as managing those conflicts of interest, is also communications and making the concept accessible, because surely that's got to be key to making it work.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. One thing I would stress is that every human is very different. They think different ways. So it can be quite tricky to give one universal message to all the staff that even if it's the best message delivered wonderfully, they all take in the same way. So I do think that how you broach the subject with the staff needs to be carefully considered. We've probably all known some employees who are super nervous, they're terrified of change, all this kind of stuff. You need to be a bit more gentle how you give them that message, because they might just hear, well, hold on, you're my boss, I like the fact that you're my boss, I like working for you, you're telling me you're selling the company, oh my god, that means you're running off, well, I have to quit now before before this becomes horrible. So I think you need to be a bit careful. I do think some founders will say, hey everyone, we're doing this amazing thing, we're selling the business to an employee ownership trust, you're all going to benefit from this, and then kind of walk off thinking the staff will all give them a big round of applause and a pat on the back, and the staff just start to panic because they've never heard of this, they don't know what it means, they've just heard that the business is being sold, so they'll be part of them thinking, well, that means I'm going to lose my job. So I think do approach it with caution. I think probably talk to the more senior team about it first, because if you get them on board, then the reality is getting the sort of more rank and file troops on board should be relatively straightforward, because there's a bunch of you that are happy with this, and also, to be blunt, the more rank and file staff tend to be less critical. If one or two of them say, no, I don't like this idea, and they leave, it's unlikely to collapse the business, whereas if your right hand man or woman does that, there's much more of a risk that it will. But yeah, I think getting staff to buy into it is a tricky one, because it does need that group effort. So, hypothetically, if you've got 20 employees, you sell to an EOT, and one of those employees thinks, wow, this is amazing, we're going to benefit for the profits, I'm going to work twice as hard. Well, they're going to be sharing the benefits of that with the other 19 that might be doing no extra. And that might quite quickly be a bit disheartening for them. So, what you're really hoping is that, maybe everyone gives 5% more, and then they all benefit from that, the combined synergies of that. But as I say, we're all different. I think the Employee Ownership Association have alluded to this. I've heard them talk about the 30-30-40 rule, in that when you mention employee ownership, when you go that way, 30% of the staff will love it. They'll really buy into it. They'll be really enthusiastic. There's another 30% that are the important ones, because they won't naturally buy into it. They'll need a bit of persuading, but with the right message, they can do so. And then there'll be 40% that will always just see it as just a job. And EOT won't change that. They'll see it as, I get my salary. You know what? Now I might get a little bonus sometimes, but I just don't care. I want to come in at 9. I'll do a decent job. I'll go home at 5. And there's no harm in companies having those kind of staff. You need those kind of staff. But I think you're setting yourself up for a failure if you're expecting every employee to suddenly change their mentality.
I totally recognise that 30-30-40 split. Mike, I'm sure you've seen that in your businesses too.
Yeah, it's a common thing. It's the same in innovation, right? Early adopters versus those individuals who are fast followers. And if you can get them on board to support an initiative like this, that'll be the energy behind it in the company. And I think that's
definitely get a few cheerleaders on board, and then the rest are easy.
Yeah, and especially those people who are influencers in the organization, and that influencers can be at any sort of level of seniority. If those influencers can start to be the kind of people they'd want to trust to sort of inform the benefit of the organization, you could see how the momentum could build quite quickly through this idea.
Yeah, I mean, I've not heard that word being used about employees before, but I think it's very true. And all, they're the most important people from this perspective, because equally, if one of those really influential people decides it's a bad idea, all of a sudden 3/4 of your staff hate the idea, and you don't quite know why. It's just because one person's been spreading that message.
It's interesting. So what's next for you then, Chris? What are you going to do with Go EO, and where are you going to take it? And is that a EOT, or are you going to do another EOT of Go EO? I had to ask that question.
Well, so possibly. I mean, at the moment, Go EO is too small for that. So there's 3 people on the staff, including myself, and one of those has only joined in the last couple of months. So at the moment, I'm the founder. There's an inevitability that in a business that small, I'm doing a bit of everything. I work on a sort of subcontract basis with a solicitor because there are some, legal nuts and bolts that have to be done right. I don't have a background in the law, so I don't want to touch that bit. The 2 employees we've taken on, the first one was a marketing person, really just to try and help get that message out a bit more. The second one is an IT person, because where I'm seeing this go, virtually every business, IT is likely to be at the center of it, especially service-based businesses. Doesn't mean we're removing the human element, but it's about making things efficient. And very much where I'm focusing on that smaller end, those efficiencies and being able to systemize things are perhaps more important than at the bigger end, because things can be a bit less bespoke, a bit more systemized. So yeah, I've got a bunch of ideas there in terms of the website becoming much less of a brochure site, which is what it is at the moment, and more of an interactive thing where people can take little quizzes to see whether EOT is appropriate for them. They can get, an indicative valuation online without having to pay thousands of pounds to a professional. And potentially, if they do go ahead with the sale, you can kind of follow it, track, but you can see how far you've got, what we're waiting on at the moment, just all that kind of stuff. And then further down the line, we've already got a staff survey, which people can use completely for free, whether you're employee owned or not. So that's something we've currently got, and we'll be working on a few other tools which are just helping those businesses that have staff to get ideas from them. So a suggestion box type thing, where you've got things that do need to be voted on, some kind of voting tool. So a lot of things that in technical terms aren't going to be amazingly innovative, and there will be tools out there that do these things already, but just trying to pull together a bunch of these tools in a nice joined up way that your average smaller employee-owned business can use them affordably. I mean, at the moment they're all free. We might be drifting towards a sort of freemium model further down the line, but we'll see.
Moving into technology, good, as everyone does at the moment. Really good.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you so much. What a great discussion. I guess the takeaways from me from this talk are that EOTs can really provide a fantastic win-win outcome for both an exiting owner and current employees, but the setup crucially has to be managed really, really carefully. And I think it's also, everyone's got to understand the pros and cons of the different options that we've talked about. So yeah, thanks again.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, and Mike, what have you got from today's talk?
It's really interesting. When I first met you, Chris, I was like, I'm curious about this idea. I kind of like it, and my business isn't right for it yet. But it's definitely in meeting you and in today's discussion, I can see a real benefit of this type of model in a kind of businesses that I work with and work in. And I think there's more companies that I know of who should seriously consider this. I understand a number of founders who are trying to sell, and actually maybe better thinking of this type of model because of the nature of their business and their personality. And I think that's the important point, right? Is where's the business, where's the team that you've got, and what's your intrinsic motivation as an individual?
Spot on, those 3 things. Yeah.
Really good. Thanks very much for your time, Chris. Really great to speak to you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Great. So thank you everyone for listening. Again, big thank you to Chris. Strive and Thrive is a regular series of discussions, and we've got a great pipeline of interesting people to share their insights with you. The next session will be in 2 weeks' time on the 28th of March. And in fact, will be an interview with Mike himself on, on people and entrepreneurship. So that should be a good one. We're now on YouTube and have a podcast on Spotify. Please do look us up. Big thanks to Mike and the rest of the Strive and Thrive team as well. So see you all next time.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers, Chris.